Thank you so much for coming to talk with me. When I was thinking about who to have as our visiting scholar in our communication cafe on the topic of family communication, you were the easy and obvious first choice. Your work on communication privacy management has been groundbreaking, and I think it has really changed and influenced how we think about families and when we think about communication in families. And so let's just start, if you will, by telling me how you came to have such a brilliant insight, how you came to the field of communication and this topic in particular.
Well, when I was in graduate school for my dissertation, I did work on disclosure, and I was just mad as all get out because there were thousands of citations and lots of findings and lots of contradictory findings. So I thought, this is pretty silly. I have to figure out a template so I can start to build some principles about issues of disclosure. And the more I dug, the more I realized that disclosure is the process by which you find out things that are important or where people are vulnerable. And so in doing that, I thought, well, that information is really private information. And the whole system of disclosure is parts of how people allow information to go out and keep information in. And so I started to do research, much of which I haven't published. But I would do a quick study and say, okay, here's what I think the relationship is. And then that would be confirmed, and something that was not confirmed got thrown out. And so I built this system to look at how people regulate, think about, and perceive the issues of privacy. Mm-hmm. Because in many ways, privacy is an illusion. Mm-hmm. But we manage it as though it's very real.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions I think comes up for me when I think about privacy is whether privacy is something within a topic. Mm-hmm. So there's topics that are just private. So not that my brother has ever been arrested, but if my brother were in jail, that would be a private topic just because the information is sensitive. But it would be the case if it were true that everyone in my hometown would know. So in that sense, it would be very public sensitive information. So is privacy something inherent in topics, or is it inherent in relationships and communication?
When we've been doing research on communication privacy management, I decided that I wasn't going to worry about what the information was. That's irrelevant. Mm-hmm. What we know is that when people start to manage the information, then it's private to everyone. Mm-hmm. You can talk about sex, and if, depending on who you talk to, they'll tell you everything you want to know, when other people will not tell you anything. And so the topic is not a sensitive topic to everyone.
It's the person's relationship.
It's the person's definition of what is making them feel vulnerable. And I think that's the core issue for most people. When you are regulating private information, that information in some way makes you feel vulnerable. So you want more control over it.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is important for students to take away, or in particular to understand about privacy and how to manage privacy through communication?
I think it's important for people to, one, know that you own your own information. You always want to control that information. But you have to be social, so you have to have co-owners. And so it really is a dialectic between wanting to be social and wanting to be autonomous. And I think it's important for people to understand that when you give information to somebody else, if you don't negotiate how you want them to take care of that information, then you have, and then sort of all bets are off. Your friend is going to tell somebody because they use their rules, not your rules. And so you might not like their rules, but if you don't talk to them about what you want them to do with it, then they're sort of left without any guidance, and they should really be knowing what you want if you want to control the information once you tell somebody.
So here's the problem in families. I don't have to tell my family members my information. They know it because they see it firsthand.
Right. So
is that why your focus on families is so prominent in your work on this topic?
Well, in fact, it isn't. It was the core piece that generated the information, but it have been applied all over the place. Yeah. But I started with families because families are so complicated, and because it was a great first step to see the worst and then move out from there. So I think that families do know each other's information. And a lot of times families do talk to each other and say, no, don't tell mom, because if you tell mom, she's going to kill me, and I don't want her to know. So you regulate some of that information and within cells within the family. And then the whole family regulates what goes outside of the family.
Right.
I mean, my parents always had definite rules. Don't talk about Aunt Jean to anybody outside of the family, because Aunt Jean was a wild and crazy woman. and
now
they
all
just
our students
didn't
know
really
about her.
That's fine. She was. I loved her, but she was a wild and crazy woman, and did all kinds of weird things. And it was always difficult for my parents to sort of explain who Aunt Jean was.
Yeah.
And so we just didn't, we loved her and all that good stuff, but we really just didn't talk about her outside of the family.
So I know we think about families as this site for where you learn so much about communication and relationships, but I'm having a new insight right now, which is reflecting on how our families are where we learn about privacy and how to manage privacy and about these boundaries we create around information. And I have a story I will also tell. I also have an Aunt Jean who is not crazy. But teaching my son, who was at the time, Jackson was 7 at the time, and he was on a soccer team. And it was the first time he had a soccer coach who really kind of yelled at the kids, was really not very instructive, but was more kind of aggressive and critical. And I could see it bothering Jackson. And my dad was a coach, so I generally don't like to say things that are disrespectful about coaches, but I said in the car one day, Coach so-and-so, his style is not necessarily one that I would really endorse. I think he doesn't explain things as well as you need things explained, and you prefer to have things explained. Well, sure enough, Jackson went to practice the next day and said, my mom thinks you're a bad coach. And that was the first of our conversations about how we might talk about other people critically, but we don't necessarily have to share it with them.
Right.
And how that's such an important lesson that starts really within the family.
Well, families do have privacy orientations that they develop. And when, Mary Claire Sorevich did a wonderful study out of her dissertation looking at those boundaries as they relate to new partners. And so when marital couples or when partners get engaged or married or establish a family, you have to negotiate, because often we've had people who come from very open families and people who come from very close families, and they really need to negotiate out what that's going to look like in their new family, because it will be different.
So Sandra, I would love to hear what you think about what communication researchers are learning about family communication as you either look at the past and think about what are some really key discoveries we've made, or what do you think are some really important questions researchers are working on now going into the future?
You mean overall, not just in terms of the privacy issues?
Yeah, either or.
Well, I think the interface between health and family is critical. I mean, that seems to be something that the communication field can definitely make contributions to. And since I have an appointment in the School of Medicine, I do a lot of work with the residents and medical students, and it is an area that I think students should be really excited about, learn about, and think about, because there is a huge future in that.
Well, and of course, communication privacy management is really essential when we talk about health issues too, because parents don't always like to disclose health conditions to children. Children need to know those health conditions. We might protect whether or not we tell even the doctor about health behaviors. So a really important intersection on that point as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important. A lot of times when patients come in and they have family members that do not speak the English language, and they're in an emergency situation, I've seen young children, 12, 13, have to interpret to their parent what's wrong with them. And so there are lots of situations
in a culture that doesn't really put a child in that kind of role.
Ever. But the child is. And so how the child has to navigate the issues of private information, whether or not the culture allows for the disclosure of the disease, are all big, big, big issues that communication scholars have the working knowledge to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the changes certainly in the sociology of the family in the last 50 years has been this huge expansion in what we think of as family, from nuclear families of childhood to step families, but I also think about the ways in which, when I was in graduate school, sort of in college, my constructed family, the people around me, and how have you seen those kinds of changes change what communication researchers or the kinds of questions they're asking about families?
Yeah. I think it is going to be even much more complicated in the future because we have genetic abilities and new technologies for conceiving children, and so what constitutes family is probably going to be more in terms of how people define it, rather than the governmental restrictions or expectations. I think that people need to be together. I think they need to have people they can depend on, and often those people are called family.
Now, thinking specifically about your work on communication privacy management, this question's been rattling around in my head, so it has nothing to do with family, but it has a lot to do with privacy. What would you have to say to students about the explosion of social media and connections like Facebook, where people certainly do manage what information they put on, but if you look broadly, it seems as though we're sharing a lot more information with a lot larger audience than we did 20 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. But one of the things that we've found is that people actually do manage their information. Whether or not they're totally successful is always a question, but we've done, 6 or 7 studies on issues of blogging, and we find that there are categories of different bloggers, and when the ones that feel like they need to manage their private information, of which that's the majority, if they blog and put something in their blog and then they realize that it could be hurtful to somebody, they go in and try to scrub it. So that says they are trying to manage not only the information, but the impression the information is making on other people. And so the system is still there. The management system that people use is absolutely represented in the new media, but it's done in a different way.
Core issues still in place.
Yeah, exactly.
Sandra, your topic is so important when you think about family communication as well as privacy management. What kinds of advice do you have for our students about what they can take forward in terms of future careers or their personal lives? I know everyone wonders what they can do with a communication major. Do you have tips on that?
Well, as an interface between the issues of privacy and knowing about how it functions and career choices, there are many applications. Working with somebody who is a development officer at a university, and that development officer feels that there's very little understanding of confidentiality, which is frightening because when you go to ask people for money to support students and student scholarships, you have to really understand that they're telling you things that are private. So I think in that regard, in the proliferation of understanding of confidentiality and privacy, there are many avenues where people need to know that information but don't think about it in a way that can be functional and practical in their everyday lives and in the jobs that they do. So if you become an expert in privacy management, you can absolutely do consulting in all different ways. In
Human resources.
Whenever there is information that people have to manage that belongs to somebody else, privacy management comes into play. And you need to set the rules and figure out what they are and abide by them and train people to do that. And so just in that small quadrant of information, there are many different ways of application for this information.
I can certainly see people with expertise in the areas that you study going on to not just either be counselors, but to help train and, as you say, consult with counselors on how to more appropriately handle the counseling interviews and the information they get.
When you talk about the new technologies, genetic testing, that is a big conundrum for people because if you find out you have a genetic predisposition, how is it you make the decision to tell or not to tell family members? And people need help learning how to do that. And so that's another avenue just within the small frame of privacy management and confidentiality that brings that information to a pragmatic stand and allows people to be able to use it in creating new jobs. I mean, that's what is the 21st century. We need new ways of thinking. We need 21st century degree programs. We need 21st century thinking about what constitutes a career, employment, how we can change our ideas about what education is and how it should look so we can prepare our students to be able to get out there and get good jobs. And I think communication is a fabulous, absolutely fabulous discipline because it is so multi-dimensional. It can be applied in so many different ways.